Yesterday, we built the toolkit for spotting tariff pass-through in real time. Today, we'll put it to work. So first on the 2018 to 2019 tariff wave, and then on the early 2025 round. We'll answer three questions. One being, how big were the price effects? Then how fast did they show up? And also, why do the two periods look different? So in this framework, each PCE spending category gets a predicted tariff effect based on its direct and indirect import content by country. We then ask, did realized inflation in that category move in line with this exposure? And there's two lenses to kind of help us see this clearly. One being an event study, so regress category inflation on its predicted tariff effect around the policy change. And so the slope tells us pass-through, and the intercept tells us how categories with little or no exposure behaved. So think of the axes of the graph. This will be the graph in the thumbnail for the videos so you guys can see it. I'll also link everything so you guys can read everything yourself too. So basically what that graph is showing you with the slope is how much excess inflation there is, the y-axis, per amount of predicted tariff effect, which is the x-axis, and that's your pass-through. Second thing that can help us is local projections. So trace month-by-month dynamics to see how quickly pass-through appears and whether there's much anticipatory pricing. And then we apply both to the late 2010s and early 2025 waves, and we get a tale of two pass-throughs, one that was fast and large back then, and then a partial and smaller one now. So for evidence, in the 2019 event window, the fitted line is steep with a slope, which they call beta because they're economists, is about 2.12 with a negative intercept. So in plain language, these categories with more China tariff exposure saw outsized inflation, while low exposure categories actually ran cooler than the pre-episode trend. So they cooled off, at least at that time. The dynamic view backs this up, with local projections show roughly full pass-through within 2 months, and the estimates cannot reject a beta is about approximately 1 at conventional levels, and that's pretty quick. So for February to March 2025, early reads from the new tariff wave point to a beta of about 0.54, a little over half, which is significant but smaller than 2018 to 19, and again has a negative intercept. So translation, exposed core goods categories went up by about half the full pass-through size, while low exposure categories were relatively subdued versus recent norms. This is consistent with what we've seen in early 2025 core goods, with price firming and exposed items without a broad inflation surge across the whole basket. So rolling up the category estimates implies about a 0.33% increase to core goods inflation so far, which maps to roughly about 0.08% to core PCE. And so these are material, but not dominant, adds to the inflation picture, and they arrive quickly. And for context, when I say core PCE, we're talking about basically the inflation of core goods. So there are three plausible drivers for why there was a smaller pass-through rate for the 2025 wave versus the 2018 to 19. So one of those being a smaller China share. So U.S. consumption is relatively less reliant on China than it was in 2018 to 2019. So a China-focused tariff hits a smaller slice. Second, so staged implementation and exemptions. The 2025 measures arrived in steps and with carve-outs, dulling a one-time shock like we saw in 2018 and 19. And thirdly, more frequent repricing. So after the pandemic, firms changed prices more often. That flexibility can dampen the apparent pass-through coefficient in an event study snapshot. So these negative intercepts from the graphs actually matter. So it says categories with low exposure to the tariff shock tended to run cooler than their prior average in the event window. One interpretation is basically the tariff is the main organized force moving exposed categories up, while the rest of the basket that's not exposed wasn't being dragged by some higher unrelated simultaneous impulse. This can also caution us not to overread the broad inflation signal from a targeted tariff. Also, the dynamics show pass-through arrives quickly, on the order of a couple months in 2018 to 19, and there's little evidence of firms pulling forward price hikes before the tariff took effect. That pattern supports the use of real-time monitoring, so you don't have to wait a year to see if something's happening. Then these estimates focus on consumer prices. They intentionally don't capture retaliatory tariffs, productivity effects, employment impacts, or strategic foreign price cuts that might offset the tariff at the border. So if foreign suppliers trim ex-tariff prices, measured pass-through to PCE can look smaller than the mechanical tariff increase itself. In conclusion, putting it all together, the 2018 to 19 tariff showed a rapid, near-full pass-through into exposed consumer categories, while the early 2025 wave shows partial pass-through so far, meaningful for core goods, but less sweeping. The difference lines up with changes in exposure, as in less China, policy design, it was more phased this time, and how often firms reprice now. The practical takeaway for listeners is tariff shocks can boost inflation quickly, but the size depends on who is targeted, how the policy is rolled out, and how firms are setting prices in that moment. Like I said earlier, I will put the actual source in the description so you guys can read it yourself. For one, I'll also put the previous video going over, or the previous episode actually going over the model itself as like a card or something, so you guys can get that easy too if you haven't listened to that one as well, just so you kind of understand what the model is a little bit better in and of itself. So with that being said, I will see you on the next one.